Welcome to this Masterclass Explainer. Today, we're taking a deeply analytical look at a challenge that, frankly, keeps development economists up at night. We're going to clinically diagnose why developing economies often grow rapidly for a while, only to suddenly hit a wall and stagnate. More importantly, we'll examine how India can successfully navigate these perilous economic waters to achieve its highly ambitious goal of becoming an advanced economy by 2047. You see, many economists warn that the Indian economy is highly vulnerable to getting permanently stuck as a middle-income country. And this isn't just some theoretical fear. It's a historical pattern that has claimed dozens of booming economies over the last 50 years. So let's dive into this. Let's unpack exactly what this concept means, why the risk to India is so real, and the precise macroeconomic steps required to escape it.
To begin, we need to rigorously define our terms. The middle income trap is not just some magical single income threshold that suddenly triggers a halt in growth. Actually, it's a systemic failure to continuously evolve. It is a prolonged stagnation in income convergence. If we look at history, take countries like Brazil and Turkey in the late 20th century, for example. They grew tremendously fast initially. How? By mobilizing vast amounts of cheap labor and basic capital. But eventually, that easy growth just ran out. They struggled to upgrade their productive capabilities across their firms, their workers, and their institutions. Essentially, they got stuck in a long-term economic purgatory. And this is exactly the trap policymakers fear India might fall into if critical structural transformations are ignored over the next 2 decades.
Here's our syllabus for today. We're breaking this down into 6 parts. 1. The economics of stagnation. 2. The 3I strategy. 3. India's structural vulnerabilities. 4. The late converger stall. 5. India's unique escape levers. And finally, 6. The roadmap to 2047.
All right, let's start with part 1, the economics of stagnation, or why economies stall out in the first place.
We have to establish the theoretical foundation here. Economic history teaches us that there are 2 fundamentally different phases of development. Early growth is honestly relatively easy. A developing country simply moves peasant farmers into basic factories, accumulates raw capital, and adopts technologies that have already been invented somewhere else. But as wages inevitably increase, the returns on just throwing more cheap labor and basic capital at the economy begin to rapidly diminish. The economy becomes squeezed. It can no longer compete with poorer nations that still have those rock-bottom wages, but it also lacks the complex capabilities to compete with advanced nations that dominate high-tech production. Pushing past this threshold requires a fundamental qualitative leap into advanced growth, a phase driven by high productivity, deep economic diversification, and crucially, indigenous innovation.
That brings us to Section 2, the mechanism, specifically the 3I strategy.
How do successful economies actually make this incredibly difficult leap? Well, we can look to the World Bank's operational framework for economic transition. This framework operates on a strict sequence known as the 3I strategy: investment, infusion, and innovation. Lower middle-income economies must first combine pure capital investment with the infusion phase, meaning the economy-wide diffusion and absorption of foreign technologies. Then, to reach upper middle and advanced status, they must progressively layer on indigenous innovation. Economies inevitably stagnate when they make one of 2 fatal errors. Either they depend on that initial investment phase for far too long, or they attempt to jump straight to frontier innovation without first building the foundational capacity to absorb existing technologies. Think about it. You simply cannot build sophisticated artificial intelligence ecosystems if your ordinary domestic firms haven't even mastered basic digital integration yet.
So this brings us to the most pressing question for our analysis today. Is India at risk of stalling before it reaches its 2047 advanced economy goals? What actually happens to a massive emerging market when its structural transformation is left incomplete and its capital is consistently misallocated over decades?
Let's get into Section 3, the diagnosis of India-specific structural vulnerabilities.
We need to take a clinical look at this. Economists are deeply concerned about a failure here to convert raw investment into actual broad-based productivity. A primary symptom of the middle-income trap is an incomplete structural transformation. In India, agriculture produces only a small fraction of the total economic output, roughly 16 to 18% of GDP. Yet incredibly, it still traps over 40% of the entire national workforce. This creates a vicious cycle. Massive agricultural underemployment leads to low overall labor productivity. Low productivity means low wages. Low wages mean weak mass domestic purchasing power, which in turn limits the scale of domestic manufacturing.
That keeps industrial employment weak and forces millions of workers to just remain dependent on subsistence agriculture. It is a persistent structural equilibrium of underutilization.
Furthermore, we see an alarming structural flaw in the corporate landscape, something economists often call the missing middle. India has a vast ocean of micro and small informal firms, and way over on the other end, a few massive world-class conglomerates. But it severely lacks a robust middle layer of medium-sized enterprises. Why does this happen? Well, severe financing constraints, stringent labor laws, and complex compliance barriers actively disincentivize growth. Firms actively choose to remain artificially small just to fly under the regulatory radar. But here's the problem. When firms remain tiny, investing in modern technology, worker training, and professional management becomes mathematically uneconomical. This directly leads to persistently low productivity across the broader economy, even if a few frontier firms are highly successful on the global stage.
We can observe a very clear, reinforcing causal chain across three major constraints. First, weak capital allocation. When distorted credit systems protect politically connected or highly inefficient incumbent firms, it starves new, highly productive firms of the capital they need to actually grow. Second, the human capital mismatch. A growing workforce is only a demographic asset if they have the right skills. Poor foundational learning and a major mismatch between university degrees and actual industrial labor demand lead directly to weak technology absorption. Finally, this all culminates in jobless and informal growth. When the economy generates GDP growth without proportionate formal job creation, workers are pushed straight into the informal sector. These informal, low-productivity firms employ low-skilled workers for low wages, which prevents those workers from investing in their children's education, locking in low productivity for the next generation. That cycle? That is the very essence of the middle-income trap.
Moving to Section 4, the late converger stall and the headwinds India is facing.
Compounding all these domestic imbalances is a concept known as the late converger stall. Here's the reality. Today's global environment is far less forgiving than it was for earlier East Asian industrializers like South Korea or Taiwan. Frankly, they had it on easy mode during an era of rapidly expanding, tariff-free globalization and carbon-intensive growth. India, by contrast, must attempt its economic convergence amidst severe external pressures. We are seeing rising global protectionism, friendshoring, and highly fragmented trade. We're seeing artificial intelligence and advanced automation directly threatening the traditional developing world advantage of cheap, intensive labor. And we are seeing strict carbon border measures that demand high standards for green production. The conventional export-led pathways of the 20th century are rapidly narrowing.
To successfully navigate these modern, high-tech headwinds, an economy requires a tremendously robust innovation ecosystem. Yet India's gross expenditure on research and development sits at just 0.6 to 0.7% of its GDP. This reveals a critical, systemic deficit. Without significant, sustained investments in R&D, university-industry collaboration, and risk capital, an economy remains highly dependent on imported advanced inputs. It struggles to move up the global value chain. The gap between mere imitation and true innovation remains unbridged.
But it is not all doom and gloom. Section 5, the antidote, and India's unique escape levers.
As analytical economists, we must remain objective, and the diagnosis here is not entirely bleak. India actually possesses several distinct structural advantages that countries like Brazil or Turkey simply did not have during their middle-income transitions. First, India has a massive demographic window, a young workforce that can drive both labor supply and mass domestic consumption for decades to come. Second, the global China Plus One strategy presents a literal once-in-a-generation opportunity as multinational firms seek to geographically diversify their supply chains. Third, India's structure of competitive federalism allows large, reform-oriented states to act as policy laboratories and dedicated manufacturing hubs. And finally, the global energy transition opens up entirely new, highly scalable frontiers for green industrialization in electric mobility and renewables.
Now, a standout advantage is India's digital public infrastructure, things like Aadhaar and UPI. But we have to be careful with our optimism here. DPI is an enabling infrastructure. It is absolutely not an automatic productivity solution. Just like a young demographic, it's only a potential dividend. If the digital rails exist, but ordinary firms lack access to complementary credit, reliable physical logistics, and skilled workers, that digital infrastructure will not translate into tangible, economy-wide productivity gains. The potential must be actively converted through sound macroeconomic policy.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, the prescription,
The Roadmap to 2047.
So how exactly does India convert these structural advantages into advanced economy status by 2047? Well, first, policymakers have to totally abandon outdated economic binaries. Too often, academic and political debates get stuck in these either-or fallacies. Should we focus on manufacturing or services? The appropriate model blends them, using modern digital and financial services to deepen the competitiveness of our manufacturing sector. Should it be state or market? Well, markets absolutely must provide resource discipline and creative destruction, but a highly capable state is still required to correct coordination failures and finance foundational public goods. Should growth be export-led or domestic-led? The answer is both. A developing economy needs mass domestic purchasing power to provide resilience, combined with globally competitive exports that force domestic firms to actually meet international quality standards.
Escaping the trap requires following a very strict, sequenced progression of structural reforms. You literally cannot skip steps here. Step 1 must be improving investment quality and capital allocation. We have to direct credit away from inefficient incumbents and toward productive scaling firms. Step 2 is accelerating technology infusion, bringing foreign direct investment in, but strictly linking those incentives to local supplier development. Step 3 is completing the structural transformation by reforming urban land and allowing that missing middle of firms to finally scale up. Step 4 ensures human capabilities align with this growth by shifting the focus from mere school enrollment to actual learning outcomes and industry-aligned vocational skills. Only then, at Step 5, can the economy successfully accelerate indigenous innovation and R&D. And finally, Step 6, none of this holds together without strengthening institutional credibility, establishing stable, rule-based regulation that survives political cycles.
To summarize the core thesis of our masterclass today, throwing more money or more cheap labor at the problem is simply no longer mathematically sufficient. India will not escape the trap merely by growing faster temporarily. It must invest better, it must learn faster, reallocate resources much more efficiently, and impose rigorous competitive discipline on its domestic markets. The raw capital must be ruthlessly converted into high, sustainable productivity across the board.
The clinical, economic path is perfectly clear, but the execution, that is extraordinarily complex. Will India successfully reallocate its vast resources, upskill its massive workforce, and innovate continuously to break through the global productivity frontier? Or will it, like so many developing nations before it, succumb to the late converger stall and remain perpetually trapped in the middle? That, I believe, is the defining economic question of this century. Keep analyzing the data, keep questioning the consensus, and I will see you in the next explainer.